Hello, welcome to How Not to Start a Fashion Brand. Today we'll be discussing the differences between in-house sampling versus remote sampling. I'm Nicole, I'm from Cloak Agency and I'm the assistant fashion designer.
My name's Evie. I am the founder and head of design at Cloak Agency.
My name is Brendan. I'm a consultant for Cloak Agency and I've just come out of working for a niche clothing brand, Amanda Led Cherry, for the last 10 years.
Before we dive in, can you both give us just a quick overview of how the sampling process typically works in your world? So Brendan, you were working with an in-house sampling team and you were working with them hands-on. And Evie, you are managing the process remotely with manufacturers on behalf of clients. So what does that workflow look like for each of you?
We assist startups and early stage established brands with their product development processes. Sampling for us starts with 3D virtual sampling. Then once the virtual samples have been approved by the client, we will proceed with placing sample orders with manufacturers. Usually the manufacturers are based in different countries to where we are based and to where the clients are based. So the samples would be created by the manufacturers and then shipped to us and to the clients.
For in-house sampling, it's quite different because the team is all on site. So it's a lot more informal because everyone's around and can answer questions on the fly, etc., which we'll get to later, but it does have its downfalls. But this would involve rough sketches, cut sheets put together, briefing to the pattern maker who works closely with the sample room. Samples get made that way. So once they're made, the team all gets together around the fitting form, fits the sample, and then the next sample round can happen. It's also worth mentioning that it's not ever one or two samples. We're putting together a full range, and in my case, in my experience, it was for two brands. So the sample set is always churning out samples. So you can get lost in that process. But that's why what we called cut sheets were put together, which will have your rough sketch or your CAD or whatever it is on it. So you know what you're fitting at any given moment, and the notes from that fitting are captured on that form so things don't get muddled up.
What would you say are the biggest strengths and limitations of your different sampling setups? So where do things generally run smoothly and where do you find that there's a hiccup?
I would say because everyone's on site, you think that you are able to kind of pass messages on the fly. You'll end up taking shortcuts with not documenting everything properly. And this, I would say 70% of the time, things get either lost in translation or forgotten about because everybody's essentially got a lot to focus on. That's one thing might not be remembered. I would say one of the hiccups is communication through documentation. When everything is documented clearly, it saves a lot of time.
So with us, I'd say our biggest challenge is that we do not have the sample room. Making a quick change isn't as easy. We do need to fill out all the documents between us and the clients, and we're usually in different locations. We have to do very detailed back and forth communication to ensure that the feedback we send to the manufacturer aligns with the changes that need to be made. Another challenge we have is that 3D fabric simulation isn't 100% accurate. So there will be small changes from going from our 3D patterns into the actual sampling fabric. But those changes are usually manageable.
On what Evie said about 3D sampling having its like downfall. So when I started working with you guys, I learned like what 3D sampling offers to the mix. And I like ran through my head of like how much that would help in certain like aspects of like how I'm used to working. And the one thing was, especially being based in South Africa, you're at the bottom of the globe. Most of your fabrics are imported. So if you've worked on like prints with a Turkish supplier, you've got to wait for that fabric to be shipped to you. But your sampling process has to start at some point. You can't wait for that fabric to arrive. So generally speaking, we would use like offcuts of fabrics, or like say we needed a specific kind of behavior of fabric, we would sample in that. But you don't get to sample it in the exact fabric until the fabric arrives. And generally behavior, if we're talking about wovens, you can navigate that. But print proportion and like print placement, that's something that you can't do until you've got the exact fabric. So we could be 6 samples down the line and then a fabric arrives and the fabric we've allocated to that style doesn't work because of whatever reason is it's being chopped up too much by too many panels or whatever. Whereas you doing 3D sampling, you would know that even before the fabric landed.
That's one of the great benefits, that a client would sometimes see the scale of a print we designed on a flat technical drawing and think that they like the size of the print. But as soon as you add it to the 3D environment, the perspective of that print changes completely. And we found that a lot of changes happen between 2D and 3D in terms of colors and prints.
That brings me to one of my questions, which is about fabric behavior in 3D. But I think, Brendan, you've also mentioned how it affects in-house sampling. Have you ever had a situation where, like you said now, Evie, where a fabric does it looked great on a screen or on a 3D virtual sampling, but once you've received that swatch or that strike off, the fabric behaves completely differently to the garment? And how did you deal with that?
One thing that's sprung to mind when you asked the question was we will look at fabrics from like swatch sheets. So you're looking at like a maximum like 10 by 10 centimeter piece. So you can't really judge the behavior of the fabric. So if I look at something, I know that it behaves like this, but that comes with experience. I am also referring to wovens here. This fabric might be a bit springy. It might have like 100% linen quality. So then I would avoid certain silhouettes or certain details because I know it doesn't make up nicely. And then say, for instance, we get the bale of fabric, it arrives, and then I'll notice that it's this, but it's allocated to a style where I don't think it'll work. We immediately sample to see if it's going to work. There's a lot more wiggle room when dealing with woven fabrics. You generally have like certain fabrics that you can use for certain drapes. So say, for instance, 100% rayon versus a cotton poplin. One's got a lot more drape and the other one's a lot more crisp. So, but when you're dealing with knits, there's a lot more variables in terms of stretch and behavior of the fabric, the return of the stretch. So when working with knits, I feel like you need to sample in that exact fabric and across colorways because the colorways change the behavior of the fabric as well.
I definitely agree with Brendan that knits are more complicated. In the physical, you would ideally start with the exact fabric that you were going to produce in. If you are going from 3D to physical, you won't be starting with the exact fabric, but we do still try to use fabrics with similar properties.
Another important thing to look at when comparing in-house sampling with virtual sampling is also the timelines. How would you say the timeline usually compares, and how many weeks would it be from start to finish when you're looking at virtual sampling? For example, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of timelines with virtual sampling or remote sampling is just the shipping times and the delivery times and the delay that causes. So, Evie, what would you say is the typical timeline for remote sampling? And then, Brendan, how does that compare to in-house sampling?
With 3D sampling, when we start the sampling process, we will have results ready within a week to 2 weeks. And then with client feedback, we can add another week to the process. So that would make up for 3 physical sampling rounds. And then you can expect another 3 physical sampling rounds, give or take, and you would need to account 8 weeks per round.
Because we're working on multiple samples, and because it's a full assortment from 2 brands in my experience, I'm referring to about 42 samples that are coming through the system. So it's like, it has to be like a well-oiled machine. So you're not working on everything all at once. Everything has its turn because it's all divided into monthly drops. But if I look at the full timeline, say for our Southern Hemisphere spring-summer launch, you're planning to launch the beginning of August. And we start sampling that range in April, if not earlier, like handover briefing to the sample room with styles by April. So if I tally that up, that's about 17 weeks from that, when that first sample is sampled to when it's production ready is about 17 weeks. But if I were to remove all the other styles, I think it would definitely be quicker because there's dedicated people doing each of these elements of the job. We're all there. We can feedback, we can change, we can like move quite quickly. But I mean, essentially listening to what you said, Evie, it's much of a muchness in terms of timelines. And yeah, it's important to note that, yes, I've mentioned, say, start in April, launch in August. There's other styles that are like being worked on at the same time. So you're not launching a full range in August. That range rolls out from August, September, October, November, December. So it's a lot longer of a process. It's if you look at it in its entirety.
So with that said, I think let's also just take a look at the amount of sample rounds. Evie, with remote sampling, how many physical samples would you say you end up needing just on average? I mean, obviously it depends from project to project, but how would you say has 3D sampling affected the amount of sampling rounds?
The number of sample rounds to be expected in the industry tends to be around 6 samples, but we've obviously seen it go under and over depending on the style and what we are starting from. Sometimes it's a very complicated style and some styles are very simple. But with 3D involved, we can then cut down the 6 sample rounds to approximately 3 sample rounds.
It sounds it's pretty much on par with what Evie was saying about the average. I would say I'm not surprised if we're doing 6 samples. It's when it starts going over that to 7 or even 8 sometimes, we're then assessing whether or not the style is actually working and we might need to bank it. And by bank it, I mean focus on it when you have the energy again, because it gets exhausting. So it would be like, say we're working on a summer season. If that style is banked, it's saved for the following summer season. So a year later. Something else that piqued my interest while you were talking, Evie, was I think why 3D sampling helps process is you're essentially working on the pattern. For me, that's like the first sample when sampling in-house is it's the starting point, and there's always a lot to fix after that. Never in my life have I seen a sample be ready after the first round. And I think that at that stage, in my case, your first sample, you're assessing proportions. So you use an example like a men's shirt with a chest pocket. Is that pocket placed in the right place? Is it too high? Is it too big? Is it too long? You and 3D sampling are assessing that before it even gets cut out into real fabric.
And that's, I think, where it helps a lot, especially for clients who are not trained in design, because for those clients, they might not be able to visualize it as clearly as someone who's used to visualizing how a 2D illustration will translate into reality. It's so quick to make changes, as you say, like shifting around pocket placement. Whereas if we were to just send a tech pack off to the manufacturer and sampling starts there, the client might realize only 8 weeks later when they receive the sample that they don't like the pocket placement, or that they wanted the hem to be 3 centimeters shorter, which then needs to go back into sampling to just see those small changes.
Using the pocket placement as an example again, I think that that's something that will stand out like a sore thumb to someone like you or myself. And you could potentially fix that before the client even sees the render. These changes that are happening so quickly on your side that the client might not even see, that if they weren't using 3D software or 3D technology, like you say, the timeline just extends itself by it gets dramatic.
Brendan, I'm quite curious to know, you mentioned earlier that when you are handling any kind of sample feedback or revisions, you said there's not a lot of documentation involved. So could you maybe explain to us how the changes are made during the sampling rounds?
I've seen the level of documentation that you guys put together, and it would never stack up. I think you guys would laugh if you to see our feedback. But just the emphasis that it's all informal, it's all in-house. So there was never the need for that. Like in terms of like communication, like as I mentioned, there's a cut sheet with a rough sketch. It's not a beautifully rendered CAD. That cut sheet is printed. It's a manual thing that gets pinned with the pattern and goes to the sample cutter and goes to the machinist, because there's notes from fitting rounds. So yeah, handwriting, very informal. Everything is documented. But often things get mentioned, like I'll have a thought one evening and then get into work the next day and say to the pattern maker, oh, I was thinking about this, we should rather do that. Those are the kinds of things that aren't documented.
Evie, can you explain how our process works and how communicating changes in sampling is different when you're working with manufacturers from overseas and there's a lot of back and forth, and obviously everything we relay has to be documented to make sure there's no misunderstanding or anything?
It's important to mention that you get different types of companies. So obviously the way things would work for major retailers is very different to how it would work for a smaller niche brand. We are talking about processes that have been developed for startups and small brands, which usually doesn't include PLM software, which is what the larger companies would use. Their feedback process would be very different to ours. Throughout the years, we've had to develop our own system for feedback. The size of CMTs and manufacturers we deal with, they usually have their own workflows in place, which means that we kind of have to develop a process around the manufacturer. But we've also come up with very streamlined documentation on giving feedback that tends to work across the board for various manufacturers. So we have a very formal process for feedback. We will fill out forms, we will link images. We usually ask the clients to also make videos, and we instruct them on how to measure what they want to change. If we also have the samples with us, we will do measurements and do in-depth instructions on where we need the changes made. Then the documentation gets sent through to the manufacturer. Everyone is CC'd in. We've got a paper trail, and everyone can go back and look at what the video said.
So let's also have a look at the differences in cost and cost effectiveness between using virtual 3D sampling that goes into physical sampling compared to just having physical sampling. What would you guys say are the real cost differences between the two in your experience? And also with regards to cost effectiveness, where are the differences and are there any hidden costs?
In-house sampling, because the sample room is part of the kind of operation, we don't run the costings like $20 a sample or whatever. It doesn't work like that. It's just everyone's role, it's what they do. Where it does cost the business is time. So you need to be aware if you can feel the sample is getting to the right point, And if that gut feeling says it's not, you have to call it to move on, because there's things waiting in the wings that need to be sampled that are coming at a later drop. So that's the kind of thing where you juggle around when you're working with an in-house sample room. There's mainly time. In terms of like fabrication and trims, in our case, and it's not always the case for everyone, our factory was on site as well. So we have a surplus of fabric from previous styles and trims like zips, buttons, etc. In terms of the materials and the trims that need to be put together to make up that sample, you're pulling from what you have already. In some ways, sampling in-house is an element of sustainability.
And Evie, would you say that there are any hidden costs involved with 3D sampling that then moves on to physical sampling? What would you say is the cost effectiveness?
Because 3D sampling, we often have people thinking upfront that it's quite expensive, because when you compare the cost of a 3D sample to the cost of a physical sample, it does sound quite expensive. However, we use very experienced pattern makers to do our 3D sampling. So whereas with manufacturers, you don't necessarily have a highly qualified and skilled pattern maker, we use pattern makers who are more skilled on a holistic levels. And they can test it immediately, as you would in real life if you were a couture designer and going from pattern to mock-up and pattern to mock-up. So there are small fit nuances that we can actually apply, which you can't necessarily do if you're just typing measurements into a computer system, printing out a pattern, and then sewing up a sample. This is definitely more akin to a couture pattern making process. While it seems more expensive than sampling rounds with a manufacturer, if you take into account the fabric costs and the shipping costs and the amount of time you're waiting, you can get that product onto your shelves much quicker.
Not a linear process when you're talking about costs, because there's so many things that you have to factor in, and you listed them earlier. It was fabrication, it was shipping, but in my case, what was important was the time, because essentially you want to get this product to market ASAP so you can start getting return on your investments. So what can you balance out in your process that mitigates the time period that it takes to make the product?
For any startups watching, like I said, the viewers, based on your own experience and just from everything that we've discussed here today, what kind of sampling setup would you recommend for a small brand that maybe has limited budget and time, but is still looking for an easy process and for quality work?
So I think this is the big question that everyone always asks. It's that everyone wants things quickly, they want it cheap, and they want good quality. And you're going to learn very quickly that you can't have all three. So you need to pick. And I would say what you pick should align with what your brand identity is. So if you want something quick, you'll have to pay for that. If you want good quality, you're going to have to pay for that. If you want it on a budget, you got to skim off quality. It's those kinds of things. So you can't have them all. It's a balancing act.
That's a very good point, Brendan. And I think a lot of people starting fashion brands don't quite understand that you can't have all three. And I'd say speed is the one that you shouldn't necessarily try and push, especially when you are in the beginning phases of starting your brand. The sampling process is extremely important, and we can try to cut down on time as much as possible with 3D. And 3D is costly, but time lost is more costly. And obviously you would still have been paying for physical samples and the shipping costs, etc. However, 3D, I do believe, is your best chance on getting it done faster and at an affordable rate if you eliminate the hidden costs. And it can help to deliver a higher quality product, just because you will have that nuanced fit that a rushed product won't.
At the end of the day, if a startup is launching their first brand, they're not going to have any idea what the timeline looks like. And no matter who you go to, there's going to be a timeline. So I think that there'll always be a surprise. And in my mind, that's not a negative. That is what it is thing. My first question to the client would be, when do you plan to launch? And then look if it's, and then work backwards to see if it's feasible. Say, for instance, it's a season-specific product, like a new swimwear range. You want to be launching that in the heart of summer. So look at when summer launches from competitors in terms of where on the calendar and depending on where in the hemisphere, and then work back from that to make it all feasible. And I mean, you guys do that. You're open and transparent from the beginning.
I agree. And I would go as far as to say that if you're a startup brand or within your early stages and you don't have manufacturing relationships set up yet, or you only have one manufacturing relationship set up, you should also account for an extra 3 months working backwards, basically because anything could happen. We've recently had a situation where tariffs changed dramatically and we had to switch quite a few clients over from one manufacturing country to another, which means we had to urgently find new manufacturers, do interviews, the whole vetting process, and get quotes and just set up the whole new relationship. But in the process, so did many other brands that were also switching from the one manufacturing country to the next. And what we learned from that is that you can never rely on the relationships you already have set up, because anything could happen in the world economy, geopolitically, and then you need to reestablish relationships. So if you are a small brand and you're vulnerable to the fact that you don't have various manufacturers across the globe, you are going to have to keep in mind that you might run into trouble. And something else that happens also is that if you're a small brand, you will probably land up on the end of the list when it comes to sampling, because any larger brands will be prioritized above you. And that is just the nature of the industry. No manufacturer is going to prioritize you over their bread and butter clients. So you will probably wait slightly longer than established client would with that manufacturer for sampling.
Just to end off the video, do you guys have any advice for anyone watching that is either thinking of starting a brand or already has a startup brand?
Treat the process as a learning experience. Also to understand that the goal behind sampling is not to get a perfect sample, it's to make mistakes along the way. So while you want to get there before 6 or 7 rounds, you'll never get there on the first round, and that's okay.
My advice would be to not enter the sampling process with any assumptions or expectations. It is a messy process, and it does take a lot of time. There is no smooth sampling process, and no two sampling processes take the same route. Every garment has its own journey.
What we can take from this video and from your experience is that the sampling process in starting a brand is probably the process that takes, I'd say, the longest, but is also the most important. So this is not the part where you can just cut corners to get it done quickly. There are lots of tools and help out there to assist in the process, like 3D sampling, for example, but it's definitely not the time to be rushing it. Thank you so much for your time today, guys. I think that was very informative. And for anyone wanting to either start a brand or who is already a startup, I think this information is very helpful. So if you would like to find out more about our agency, or if you have any other questions, you can find our link to our website in the description box below. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like these, in which you can learn lots of tips and tricks from industry professionals. And please feel free to leave a question in the comments below.